Welcome to the Pan Am Podcast, brought to you by the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York. This podcast and our museum are dedicated to celebrating the legacy of the world's most iconic airline, Pan American World Airways. My name is Tom Betty, and I'm the host of this program. Thank you for joining us. This program is sponsored by the generous support of Mr. Adam Aron, the CEO of AMC Entertainment Holdings Incorporated. The Pan Am Museum Foundation is a nonprofit organization. Please visit our website for more information at thepanammuseum.org. Again, our website is thepanammuseum.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. If you are using Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving a review. It will help others discover this program. If you're not familiar with Pan Am, welcome. We are honored to have you here, and for you to learn about what we're all about. If you already know of Pan Am, worked for or flown on the airline, or just love our history, it's good to be with you again. So with that, let's get this episode in the air, so to speak. Welcome aboard your Pan American Jet Clipper. In this episode, we are joined by Dan Colussy, who served as Pan Am's president and chief operating officer in the 1970s. Dan will share his experiences of working in the airline industry during a pivotal point in Pan Am history. But first, an update on this podcast and our YouTube channel. As of June 2023, the Pan Am podcast has been downloaded almost 100,000 times in more than 156 countries. And our YouTube channel has over 2 million views, totaling 270,000 hours of viewing time with almost 12,000 subscribers. Truly a remarkable achievement that could not have been possible without people like you. Also, we are cross-promoting this program with another podcast for both of us to be introduced to each other's listeners, especially because we both love aviation. So I'd like to take a moment to tell you about a fun new podcast called So There I Was. If you're a fan of aviation or simply enjoy hearing captivating stories, then this is the podcast for you. Hosted by former Marine pilots Fig and Repeat, this podcast shares firsthand accounts of flying experiences that will have you on the edge of your seat. Whether you're in the mood for something funny, scary, poignant, or tragic, this podcast has it all. With a relaxed and conversational tone, the pilots share their stories like you're sitting right there with them at the bar after a flight. Hear from fighter pilots, astronauts, Blue Angels, aircraft carrier captains, Navy and Coast Guard rescue pilots, and many more. Most have survived near-death experiences. Others have overcome incredible disabilities to continue to fly airplanes. You'll hear about heart-pumping moments in the cockpit, hilarious screw-ups during flights, insane hijinks off-duty, and the challenges pilots routinely face. Hear what it feels like to be shot off the bow of a carrier or into space. Experience the terror of landing on a pitching deck at night, so black that the pilots can barely taxi afterwards because his legs are shaking so badly. Hear firsthand how lonely it is in the middle of the ocean in a life raft on a dark night in 8-foot seas. Each story is unique and told with a level of detail that will make you feel like you were there. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and you'll laugh until you cry. But one thing is you will not be bored. So again, the podcast is called So There I Was. It's how all great aviation tales begin, and you can find it on whatever platform you listen to podcasts. Now on to our interview with Dan Colussy. Dan Colussy was born on June 3rd, 1931. He just celebrated his 92nd birthday, and everyone at the Pan Am Museum wishes him the happiest of birthdays. After serving in the U.S. Coast Guard after college, Mr. Colussy began his career in engineering at General Electric, and then went on to work for American Airlines and Northeast Airlines in executive marketing positions before joining the prestigious advertising agency Wells, Rich and Green as Senior Vice President, overseeing the Trans World Airlines account. As a result of a chance encounter with the Pan Am CEO on a TWA plane over the Atlantic, Mr. Colussy was hired by Pan Am in 1970 as Vice President of Marketing and Development, and in a short period of time was promoted to Senior Vice President of the same division. In 1976, Mr. Colussy was promoted to Executive Vice President and was elected as a member of the Board of Directors of Pan American World Airways. 2 years later, in May 1978, he was elected President and Chief Operating Officer of Pan American World Airways by the company's Board of Directors. William Sewell remained Pan Am CEO and Chairman. He left Pan Am in 1980 to pursue other opportunities in the airline and aerospace industries. Mr. Colussy is a very successful and respected businessman. Among his many pursuits, he served as chairman and CEO of Canadian Pacific Airlines and is the former chairman of Iridium Satellite, which he took out of bankruptcy in 2000 and rebuilt it into a global and profitable satellite network providing communication services for over 1 million customers worldwide. Today, Mr. Colussy is the chairman of Gemini Capital, a venture capital fund investing in new technologies. Welcome to the program, sir.
Yes, Tom. Pleased to be here.
So let's start with where you grew up and how you got involved with the aviation business.
I grew up in Western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh until I was about 13 years old. I started in aviation when I was in fourth grade because part of my family had a farm up in Cottersport, near Pennsylvania, and the three sons of my grandfather's brother started an airport. So they had three planes, a grass strip, they had a hangar, and so forth. They had air shows there and rocket cars, the whole 9 yards, and it was free. And if you went, the Boy Scouts would park your car for you. This was in I was about in fourth grade. What year? About 9 years old, I guess.
And what year was this?
This would have been 1930. Let's see, if I was 9 years old, it would have been 1939. Mm-hmm. So I had my first flight. I was in fourth grade, okay, in a Piper Cub and in the back seat and so forth. It was great. So I was aviation oriented. My whole family. I had several of my older cousins, like 19 and 20. One especially I was close to was a P-51 pilot in World War II, so he was my hero. So I was involved in aviation right from the start. Then, of course, World War II broke out when I was 11 years old. Of course, my father was too old to serve. He was 40, but he was recruited to because he was an architect and a builder, and he was recruited to go to Tampa, Florida, to build concrete ships, Liberty ships. A Liberty ship is 460 foot long. They were cargo vessels. They were the standard ones that were being built in World War II to carry cargo. So there was steel shortage. They decided to try to build these ships out of concrete, and that was done in Tampa, Florida. So the whole family got moved to Tampa, Florida. I had a younger brother and a younger sister, and we all moved to Florida when I was in 8th grade and so forth. So during the war we spent there, my father participated in this, and they built 24 concrete Liberty ships, okay? And they worked fine. And after the war, they were all sunk and made into breakwaters and stuff. But they carried cargo and did their job in World War II. So I finished high school in Pennsylvania and then decided to go to prep school in Washington, D.C. because I'd moved around so much in my high school. I wanted to cement my education a little better. So I went to a boarding school in Washington as a postgraduate situation for my high school. And while I was there, we had a visit from a Coast Guard officer, and he showed us these wonderful pictures about the Coast Guard Academy and the sailing on the Eagle and all those wonderful things like that. So I took the exam and placed 31st in the country. So I decided, well, I didn't know anything about the Coast Guard Academy, but it looked like a lot of interesting stuff. And you got an engineering degree. So I decided to go there, which I did, and spent my 4 years there. We had an aircraft station academy, so we got into aviation there. And in our second class year, we spent at an air station in North Carolina, and got some flight time in there as well. So I was very much oriented towards that, and of course my family orientation towards aviation as well. On active duty, this was during the tail end of the Korean War. I was in the Coast Guard. I was stationed in Yokosuka, Japan, on a ship that was patrolling off of the Korean coast to get down to aviators or whatever was required of us. In the Coast Guard, to become an aviator, you have to spend your first 18 months at sea duty. Then you go to Pensacola and become a naval aviator, and that's 18 months. So you have to serve another 3 years. So I decided, even though I wanted to go to flight school, I just couldn't see spending all those years because I really wanted to get out and have a civilian career.
So what was your first job out of the Coast Guard?
So I spent my 3 years at sea duty, get out of the Coast Guard, and then I was recruited by General Electric in their flight propulsion division. And that was my first civilian job. And I worked as an engineer in the flight propulsion division on jet engines. That was beginning in 1956. And it was the early days of jet engine. We did a lot of development work on new jet engines. So I became quite an expert on jet engines. And during that session, I was in Boston. Actually, I decided, even when I was in the Coast Guard, to go to graduate school. And I applied to Harvard. And at that point, I went to Harvard and got my MBA and graduated in 1965. The majority of my classmates went to Wall Street because that's where you made all the money and so forth. But I just couldn't see myself doing that. So I really settled in on the airlines because, for one thing, I took a look at the airlines, the management teams. So I interviewed several airlines, and I had a great interview with the senior vice president of operations at American Airlines, who was a Naval Academy graduate and also Harvard Business School graduate. And he convinced me this would be a great, career for me and so forth. So that fit right in with my goals. I should say, in the meantime, when I got out of the Coast Guard, I went to a commercial aviation school using the GI Bill. Went through and got my commercial license. So I was a commercial pilot at that point. So this all fit in. I have an engineering background, and I had an MBA and also my commercial pilot's license. So I thought it would be great to look at the airlines. This individual that recruited, he was impressive, and he gave me a good sales pitch and turned out to be my mentor. So that was great. So I went to work for American Airlines, based in Manhattan, 266 3rd Avenue, the headquarters of American. After the first year and a half or so, within the first 2 years, my mentor then was offered the job to go as president of Northeast Airlines in Boston. Northeast Airlines had been a small regional New England airline, but they were acquired by Storer Broadcasting, and Storer wanted to expand it, and they were able to get routes to Florida out of all the northeastern cities and the Bahamas, both to Freeport and Nassau and so forth. So the airline was in a big expansion, going to some new exciting destinations at that point, out of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, up down to not only Florida, but to the islands. So that was a great experience for me. And I became the executive vice president of marketing. So I had all that work under me. And now I was away from engineering, and I was doing some pretty interesting things in marketing, which I enjoyed a lot.
Okay, so you're a young man at this time in your late 20s. American Airlines was your first airline job. And then you followed your mentor to Northeast Airlines, building up quite the resume. What happened next?
At that point, I was recruited by Mary Wells. Name may not mean anything to you. She was a very successful woman who started the first female-owned advertising agency in New York called Wells, Rich and Green. She had two partners that were men. But she was the leader, very dynamic gal. Her husband was also the CEO of Trans Airlines. So staying in the airline circuit here, and she hired me because she had the Braniff account because her husband was CEO. And in those days, she did a very dramatic thing. She painted all the airplanes in Braniff pastel colors, pink. Very successful campaign. It was just unique. And Braniff had started to fly to South America, and they had 747 and so forth. So, but then she landed the TWA account, which was a huge account for her. So she recruited me to go from Northeast to back to New York and work for her and take over the TWA account. So that's how I got back, over involved with TWA, and so I developed some new programs for them, and they worked.
For our listeners, Wells, Rich, and Green was a famous ad agency, most notably behind the I Love New York campaign, Plop, Plop, Fizz, Fizz Alka-Seltzer campaign, and the Raise Your Hand If You're Sure deodorant campaign, just to name a few. So, Mr. Colussy, you told me before the interview about a chance encounter you had with someone on a certain flight over the Atlantic that changed the course of your career. Let's talk about that.
I was flying around the TWA system, flying to the Paris Air Show on TWA, and I think you must have heard that story because you mentioned it. So I, just by sheer accident, my seatmate was Najib Halabi, who was then the CEO of Pan Am, and he said he started a chat, of course, and. So when I found out who he was, I said, "What are you doing at TWA, by the way?" And he said, "I do this because I like to check out the competition, see what it's like." Good idea. So we were chatting away, and he said, "Yeah, I've heard about you. You're really giving us a bad time." And so I know who you are, but I don't know you personally, but I know about you. So we chatted, had a nice chat across the Atlantic. And that was it. I went to the Paris Air Show and so forth. So we did our TWA thing. And I got back to New York, and maybe a couple of weeks later, I had a call from a headhunter I knew, and he said, "Hey, Najib Halabi like to have lunch with you. Would you be willing to do that?" And I said, "Oh, sure, why not? Nice guy." So we had lunch, and he said, "Would you be willing to come to Pan Am because I'm looking for somebody to be involved in marketing and has some new ideas and more aggressive and so forth." So I said, "Well, that would be of interest. I'm making a lot of money and working for an advertising agency, so I would compensate." He said, "Well, we could, probably can work that out." So I interviewed with him and some of the other guys. I could see the marketing guys at Pan Am were not that interested in my company. They were satisfied. So what Najib was trying to do was just, stir things up, because the head of marketing at Pan Am was called the vice president of, they didn't use the term marketing, traffic, vice president of traffic. That was a traditional old line airline title because, they were responsible for traffic, for getting the traffic, and that's the title they used. So they were a little bit behind the times. Still a wonderful airline. J.W. Thompson was their ad agency, and of course, they're a global, large agency. They did some very conventional ads, good stuff, but not very innovative and pretty routine. So I decided to accept. I mean, it was an opportunity to get into a airline. Of course, I could see then that they were already a troubled company. They had lost money, and they were struggling. It's still, they served 120 cities and I think 85 countries and something like that. Still a very global company, but they had been denied any kind of domestic routes. So they were stuck. They flew out of 10 gateway cities in the U.S., outbound and inbound, but couldn't, even on the round the world flight, where the left from New York and San Francisco to around the world. It took 5 airplanes to do that, but they couldn't fly transcons. Passengers in New York had to get off. They wanted to go in the interior or the West Coast and take another airline. The same thing if they were coming eastbound from the Pacific. It was a strange situation. They said, why is this? Because we had no feed traffic. We had to get everything. So we had to make deals with the domestic carriers and to get past feed traffic into our gateway cities. So I found out pretty quick, Pan Am was in a tight situation because, you're denied feed from all of the huge marketplace in the U.S. And you just we could obviously promote in those cities. And, certainly Pan Am was well known. But if you wanted to fly from Columbus, Ohio to overseas, you took a domestic carrier, and then the domestic carriers, all of them, favored the foreign flags because the foreign flags gave them these extraordinary deals. When you share a passenger from domestic international, you share the fares, and there's a formula for that, where the international guys give some extremely lucrative deals to the domestic carriers, so they were inclined to feed Lufthansa, British Airways, Japan Airlines, what have you. And that was a big problem for Pan Am because we didn't have any feed. And then the domestic carriers were favoring the international carriers, who are our competitors. I mean, to New York, London, for example, we had 8 carriers flying New York, London. It was a fight, to get carriers. The travel agents were the same way. They were leisure part of the national travel was over half the business. So that was handled mostly by travel agents. So it was Pan Am was in a real bind. So I finally worked my way up the ranks. And then in the meantime, Halliby was, I have to say, he was fired basically by the board. And he went, and that's when they brought in Bill Sewell. I had actually known Bill Sewell.
Tell us more about that.
When I was at Northeast, he actually offered me a job to come to work with him. And his first job out of the Air Force was to be president of Rolls-Royce North America, which was the engine company. And but I said, no, thank you. I'm in the airline business now, Bill. So, but at any rate, so he comes to Pan Am, and obviously I know him and have a nice relationship. Our wives knew each other and so forth. And I think I helped him, and he obviously helped me as well. And we did some good things. And of course, in the middle of all this, the oil crisis hit. The 70s were not a good decade for the airline business, for any business. There was minimal growth. We had, a couple of major recessions, but the big thing was the oil crisis that began in October of 1973. It was giant for Pan Am because we bought 80% of our fuel internationally. And we had been paying 15 cents a gallon, for jet fuel since the advent of the jet airplane. That's what it was. So nobody thought much about the cost of the fuel because it was, low, a low price. So overnight in October of 1973, the price of our fuel, because it's all related to this, historic battle, the Yom Kippur War and all that, and the OPEC was formed, and they decided they put an embargo on fuel worldwide. This was during the Nixon administration, and Nixon had put in price controls on petroleum products. So the domestic airlines, when the embargo happened, didn't have any impact on them. Their prices went up, but they were frozen by this edict from President Nixon. We bought our 80% of our fuel internationally, which went from 15 cents a gallon to 44 cents a gallon.
Holy smokes.
Overnight. Overnight.
Wow.
That was absolutely hopeless situation. You can't raise fares to make up that kind of.
Mm-hmm. What did TWA do? Because they had domestic and international.
TWA had very minimal routes, compared. They just flew the North Atlantic. And that's all they had. They didn't fly the Pacific or Latin America. So that was international, perhaps it's 20%, around 20% of their total business. Ours was 100%. So Pan Am was really in a bind. And then we had 41,000 employees at that point. And we went through a dreadful period where we just had to cut back on routes. We had to analyze every route we flew. And a lot of the routes were, developmental routes where we were building the traffic over time. And so we had to abandon all that. We cut back, a very painful period. We cut back from 41,000 employees to about 28,000. And as the senior managers of the company, it was very hard to do that, but we had no choice. We're losing money. The banks are on our case. But that actually turned the company around. We started to break even. And then we're getting now into the late 70s again now. And I was the executive vice president of marketing and services. So I had all the service people under me. I had over half of the employees would work for me at that point. So we struggled, but we were making progress because we had reduced our costs hugely. We were able to raise our fares somewhat, and of course, we had to deal with the introduction of the 747 as well.
Let's talk about the 747 because it was revolutionary when it was introduced. But the 1970s were a very turbulent time for the airlines, especially international carriers like Pan Am. There was the oil crisis and a new age of terrorism. Let's talk about the 747. You joined Pan Am right when the aircraft was launched and the jumbo jet era began.
The 747 was obviously a great airplane. It did enable lower fares because the seat mile cost was lower compared to a 707 or in smaller airplanes. So you had room to lower the fares. And when I was a marketing guy, even before I took over services as well, it was just pass-through marketing. That's when I interfaced with Juan Tripp. He was still around then, and of course he's the one who brought Halaby in and so forth. He thought Halaby was going to help us with the government situation because Halaby had been head of the FAA under the Kennedy administration. So he thought he was bringing somebody in who could have a little horsepower in D.C. So that's when I started to go to Washington to try to, of course, we had to explain why we wanted to raise fares to compensate for the fuel and all the other huge issues we had with no domestic routes. That's when I really was astounded to find out the negative attitudes about Pan Am and the bureaucrats in Washington. The routes still had to be assigned, and at that point, they started to award international routes to some of the large domestic carriers as well. So we had quite a battle on our hands. But the interesting part, I shouldn't say interesting, the negative part of it was it was this very negative view of Pan Am and the bureaucrats, and that's when I started to go to D.C. in a period of time. I was, wow, what did we do? I mean, what's the problem here? I finally got some of them to talk, frankly, and what they told me, and I can't vouch for this as being the absolute truth. This is what I was told by bureaucrats. Well, we don't like Pan Am because if you go back in the history of Pan Am, Juan Tripp tended to bypass us at the CAB and so forth. And the story was, and I as I said, I can't vouch for the truth of this, but I'm just telling you what I was told, and it seemed reasonable. Okay, that in Pan Am's heyday, when he first started, let's say during World War II, when Roosevelt was the president, Pan Am was really getting into its own. This would be in the 40s.
For our listeners, the CAB stands for the Civil Aeronautics Board. So I think I know where you're going here. Juan Tripp was not only good friends with Franklin Roosevelt, but his brother-in-law, Edward Stettinius, held many high-level positions in the Roosevelt administration, and became U.S. Secretary of State in June of 1944. Many of the bureaucrats on the CAB had ties with people in other airlines and resented Pan Am for many years afterwards for that special relationship with President Roosevelt. Give us your insight.
So Juan had access in the government, well above the bureaucrats than the CAB. So when something didn't go so well, he would go to his father-in-law and say, those idiots at the CAB, that's my own phrase. They're doing this to us and they're hurting us, which they were, by the way. But so he was able to bypass the minions at the CAB, and you're in the government service yourself, so there's a institutional memory in the government agencies. So that I was told that. I assume it's true. It sounded logical and so forth. And that they were just against Pan Am. I mean, there was no doubt about it. And we were doing things. And I got to know some of these guys. And I say, why are you screwing us? I mean, this is ridiculous. Well, yeah, this reason we have to let the domestic carriers have international. Okay, well, give us some domestic routes too. Okay. Let us fly our Transcon from New York to San Francisco for openers or our around the world flight. Well, it was just a bad scene. Okay. Deregulation clouded that up because we were already deregulated as far as I was concerned, because the foreign flags were, I remember one issue with the State Department, especially KLM flew to New York, and then they wanted to expand to Chicago, to Houston, to San Francisco, and Seattle. In fact, I was asked to testify in the CAB hearings in those days. So they were granting KLM all these new routes to the U.S., and we had one destination in Netherlands. What's that? Amsterdam. That's the only city of any size. And so we had New York, Amsterdam, big deal. KLM had Amsterdam, New York, Washington, Boston, Chicago, L.A., etc. I won't let name them all. So I was talking to the State Department guys. I said, can't you guys protect American companies because we're getting killed here? They said no, and they said, well, so it went up the line to Kissinger, and he said, no, we have to be nice on that, and they're going to buy F-14s, and that's a high priority for the country. So I'm smiling, but I mean, it's like, what? They're going to buy F-14, so that's why they get all these routes. But that's the kind of stuff that we were told. It was horrible. And of course, the the Dutch, I give them credit for this. They are mercantile people. Okay, they've been trading for this little tiny country, and in Europe has been a very prosperous trading company for decades and decades. It's probably, and they had every trick in the book. I mean, they're one of the worst carriers to compete with because they had every dirty trick in the book in terms of special deals and so forth. I was actually friends with the CEO of KLM, Sergio Orlandini. He was an Italian guy. Somehow got to be CEO of KLM. So he and I became friends because I was Italian heritage also, and we had that little commonality at any rate. So that's what was happening to Pan Am. We had a huge struggle.
Let's circle back. So you knew Mr. Tripp, Mr. Hallaby, and Mr. Sewell personally. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what they were like? Let's start with Mr. Tripp first.
Well, Juan Tripp was a giant. Okay, I mean, everything that said about him was true. He was very aggressive. He built Pan Am from flying from Key West to Havana in 1929 to what it was. But it was interesting. He had a formula which, if you knew the company, you could follow it. His primary strategy was to always be first with the biggest and the fastest airplanes, and he did that with the Clippers and so forth. We had the biggest flying boats, the fastest ones, and so forth. And Of course, we were early on with the 707, and in fact, we were buying when I arrived in April 1970. I came to Pan Am. They were still taking deliveries on 707s and DC-8s. And then, of course, Pan Am came out with the announcement, I think in 69, don't hold me to that, but it's about the 747 order, which was, revolutionary order, Pan Am Order 25, 747. And the story there was he was good friends with Bob Allen, who was the chairman and CEO of Boeing. They obviously were good friends. He bought many Boeing airplanes through the years. And Boeing offered the 747 to all the airlines, and I think without exception, they rejected it because it was too big too soon. They were still digesting the 707 and the DC-8s and so forth, but not one. This was right up his hosepipe, so to speak. Biggest airplane, fastest airplane. It's going to revolutionize air transportation, which it did. And he jumped right in, ordered 25. And even though they were very cheap in those days, the first 747 cost $18.5 million.
Wow.
Today, a 747 sells for, I don't know, 200 million, something like that. I'm not sure the exact price, but it's way up there. But nevertheless, 25 of them was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And once it was announced that Pan Am was doing this, it was a huge, exciting announcement worldwide. But it was, how can you have an airplane that big that carry 400 passengers? My God, when you have a crash. It was a positive and a negative, but mostly positive. Of course, the other airlines, especially the international airlines, hey, we're not letting Pan Am get away with this. So they all placed orders. Of course, TWA did, and the domestics were a little slower to order them because they just didn't have the need for that longer range and the capacity, and so forth. But I think American ordered a few and so forth, but the real orders came in from the international guys who we were competing with. And so every airline put in big orders for 747s. So one said, geez, we only ordered 25. We better order 8 more. So we had 33 coming. Then we started thinking about freight. But gee, these would make beautiful freighters.
Wow. So
we ordered 6 more, 6 freighters coming. And there's another, the 747 SP is still to come. Okay, that's more 747s coming. But that's later on. So here we are. We're still taking deliveries on 707s and DC-8s. They're about, they were still had a, forget the numbers we had, but, a substantial number of those airplanes. And so the 747 arrived at a very poor time in terms of the world economy. It wasn't on a good time. The 70s were a whole situation with the OPEC and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, you have hijackings, terrorism.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah, that was.
I mean, the 70s were a tumultuous period.
That's my whole experience with Pan Am, so I can attest to that. Speaking of hijackings, it's an amusing part of hijacking. So in the early days, about once a month or so, we'd get hijacked because some Cuban wanted to go to Havana. And so we'd have to land in Havana. They never did any damage to the planes. They would have to, nonstop to Rio, had to land in Havana and had to wait around until got approval to leave. The guy got off the plane and fine. There was never any violence there at all, except one day, the plane was there for like 4 or 5 hours. We're saying, hey, what's the problem here? Get that flight moving. I mean, it's bad enough to get hijacked, but now we're there for 5 or 6 hours. The word came back out. Castro heard about it, and he'd never seen a 747, so he wants to inspect the 747.
Oh, wow.
So the plane had to wait there while Castro came. And when the captain came and tour of the plane, this is great. So, okay, you can leave now.
Very interesting. Totally different time because obviously, as we know in history, the hijackings became violent in the 70s and violent in the 80s as well.
These were friendly ones. They of course, obviously, if you already said it, got much worse internationally. We were pretty fortunate. The worst one we had was in Rome, and it was on the 707 when PLO came on board and took over the airplane at the gate, and they tried to get him off, and he threw some hand grenades down the aisle and kills, I forget the number, it might have been 6 or 8 people were killed on the airplane, and the airplane had a hole blown in and so forth. But
terrible situation.
Yeah, that was fortunately it wasn't an airborne type thing where we lost it. It killed everybody, but it was bad enough.
So when you joined Pan Am, Juan Trippe was already retired, but he was still working. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with him.
He was certainly there. He was working there. And he would, because I was the marketing guy, he would come by my office and say, gee, this plane, the 74 is going to let us lower fares. We had to lower seat mile costs. And I said, Juan, I totally agree. And so we came up with a lot of innovative fares, which then we were still part of IATA. So it had to go through the whole IATA bureaucracy when you wanted to lower fares.
We are going to take a quick break with a Pan Am commercial from 1979.
Because we fly people who move the world, and people who watch the world, people who make the world work, and people who make the world smile, we've got a good idea what the world wants from an airline. So we have our full-service economy class, offering every Pan Am passenger complete service no matter how inexpensive their ticket. We have Clipper class, giving full-fare passengers even more service, including free drinks and hors d'oeuvres, plus an empty seat beside them whenever possible. And in first class aboard our 747 SPs, we're introducing a luxurious new table-for-two dining and unique reclining sleeperette seats, the most comfortable chairs in the air. Now we've got 3 great ways to fly the world.
Pan Am.
Welcome back to our interview with Dan Colussy, President and Chief Operating Officer of Pan Am in the late 1970s. For our listeners, IATA stands for the International Air Transport Association, and it sets technical standards for airlines, formulates industry policy and standards, and also fixes airfare prices.
Pan Am actually founded IATA way back in 1930 or something. And those days, there were 106 airlines in IATA. I'm sure there's a lot more today. But in those days, the fares had to be submitted through IATA, and they were if they were approved, then that became, the legal fares. And in the U.S., the CAB had to approve them after IATA approved them, so they became legal fares. If you sold, you were breaking the law in the U.S. if you sold anything other than what was the approved fare, because it had gone through the IATA approval and then by the CAB. So there was still a CAB in those days. The CAB didn't go away until 1978, I think, is when the CAB was dissolved. But and those were the fares. Okay, so we had to abide by. Our lawyers were very rigid on that and said, don't just play around with these fares, because you'd be breaking the law. Well, the foreign flags were having a field day because they had every trick in the book to discount the fares to travel agents in ways which weren't, and we couldn't do that. We were getting into legal trouble, so we were hurting from that quite a bit, and hurt quite a lot, I should say. And because we were, in addition to have no domestic feed, we had to deal with all this unethical behavior of the foreign flags. And as I already said, KLM was a master of this. They had every trick in the book, as did every other airline for that matter.
And they have their government supporting them.
They didn't worry about a profit because they were not publicly. They were not privately owned. They were owned by their governments. It's just they were a government agency, almost without exception. Then that's changed, of course, dramatically, and now in current times. But back then, they were 100% owned. They were an instrument of national policy. Okay. And if they want to develop tourism, yeah, let's find ways to bring tourism here. And if we need low fares, who cares? Nobody really cared, it seemed. The president of Alitalia told me once, I don't know whether I was president then or not, but I forget, but I knew him and I used to meet him at meetings, and he said, I said, you guys keep doing this and dropping fares to, we're gonna join you, and we're gonna fight you, and we're gonna. I was saying that knowing he couldn't do it, and he knew I couldn't do it. He said, "Come on, you guys are not gonna do that." He said, "Besides, when you're bleeding, you don't want to fight a blood bank, okay? And that's us. In other words, we had unlimited money, so don't."
Any other personal stories you'd like to share about working with Juan Trippe?
Well, Ron would he would come to my office and say, can't we lower some fares? And I said, Juan, look, we've instituted for the first time youth fares, senior citizen fares, group fares. I had hated all this because this was group fare. I mean, the travel agent could set up a tour and we could give him a special price. So we were doing all that. And I said, you get the ideas. We're open to it because we're doing, everything you can do to lower fares. And it was stimulating traffic. I mean, there's no doubt the 747 permitted the average citizen to fly internationally. And that was a big thing. Before that, it was only the upper strata that flew internationally and so forth. And now this opened up the whole world. And Pan Am was developing markets all over the world. In Japan, for example, we were the first ones. JAL was still in its incipient stages. They weren't that aggressive. So we started to fly Japanese tourists for the first time. After the war, they didn't go anyplace. And suddenly they had the resources. Now they wanted to start flying. So we obliged them. And we developed markets out of Japan. We flew tourists to, the first flights we had were to Guam. And Guam is, there's nice beaches and there were some hotels there. And God, we had a real successful market going. And then we flew to Indonesia, to Bali, for Japanese tourists. They loved it. And they have these mass weddings in Japan. Like 100 couples will get married at once and they all take a vacation together. So we were exploiting all that. We had a real good market. And then we said, hey, let's try Hawaii. They loved Hawaii. We had 2 or 3 flights a day from Tokyo to Hawaii. But then, of course, once we did that, JAL got onto it and then Aaron Pond eventually and so forth. But for a while there, we were very, innovative and developed these markets. So, but getting back to Juan, we did everything we could. I had a good relationship with him. I admired him, obviously. I mean, who wouldn't admire Juan? His 2 sons worked for the company, Ed and Charles, and I was good friends with them. One worked for the hotel company, and Charlie, he was in charge of planning and route planning and stuff. And so it was a happy family. I mean, it wasn't a lot of internal fighting. Then I'm trying to think when it was, maybe after Hallaby. I'm not sure, but Juan then sort of did fade away. He was out of the company. I think that's about the time Hallaby was let go and Bill Sewell took over. Bill Sewell and I had a very good relationship. As I said, went back years, and I think I helped him and he helped me. I think we had a very good relationship. I was promoted and I became executive vice president of marketing and services, because I always complained about the flight attendants. If they were part of marketing, we could incentivize them more and so forth, which is true, by the way. Because then I used to have a lot of meetings with flight attendants all over the world. We had, we had a lot of foreign flight attendants, and because they had the language capability, and so we had a lot of Scandinavian, Japanese, a lot of Germans, women, and so forth, and they were excellent flight attendants. In those days, They had retired at age 32. Okay.
Wow. That's wild.
They reported in, they had to be weighed and they had to wear girdles and so forth. Can you imagine us getting away with that today? I mean, but they loved it. I mean, these were, mostly college educated because they had to speak a language. And we had the top-notch flight attendants. But they were an independent bunch, though. And they had a leader that got to be very militant. I forget her name now, but she was tough. And so anyway, yeah, I knew Bill was fine. And and I knew his wife very well, Judy. So we were the first Americans to go in Japan. We were to the People's Republic of China in January of 1974. We were invited to visit China, the People's Republic of China. They had just been opened up. If you remember, Kissinger and Nixon opened that up, and we were pretty much the first Americans, or the first group of Americans that visited there. George Bush and his wife were the American representatives in then Peking before it was changed to be Beijing. And so we got to meet the Bushes as well when we flew in there. And we spent 3 weeks, and we got the VIP tours. We had these chauffeur-driven cars. They were Chinese made. They looked like old Packards, you know. So every place we went, we flew into. In those days, you couldn't fly into China. Only when the Russian airplanes could fly into China. So we flew into Hong Kong and then went to New Territory in China, which is the northern part of Hong Kong. And there's a bridge. We literally walked into China. Bill Sewell and I and his wife, and we had a couple with us, and we had to carry our suitcases and walked over this little bridge to get into China. And there got on a railroad and went to Canton. Of course, they changed the name there as well. And we were welcomed every place we went.
So you were hired by Mr. Hallaby. Can you describe the leadership style of Mr. Hallaby and Mr. Sewell and the differences between their two leadership styles?
Najib Hallaby was very personable, but inexperienced in commercial matters. Okay, I'll put it that way. He had been head of the FAA and he'd been a Navy pilot and so forth. He's very good looking, handsome, attractive, well-spoken, all those wonderful things. As I said earlier, I think Juan hired him, even though he had no airline experience, because he felt he had, it was the Kennedy administration, he thought that he had some horsepower in DC. And Hallaby would be the first one to tell you, look, that's not why I want this job. That's not what I want to do. It's not. But anyhow, that's why he was hired. But I think I would say that since he had no commercial experience at all, I don't think he'd ever worked, best of my knowledge, he'd never worked for a company. He'd always been in the government, military, and so forth. So this was all a real chore to him. And he was very involved in charities and stuff. He was very liberal, so he was involved in, a lot of the charities in New York and so forth, all of which was fine, except the company was in dire shapes, okay? The company was losing money, big money. The banks were on our case and so forth. So I would say Najib he just didn't have it, okay, as a CEO. He had a lot of the characteristics, but he didn't have that commercial drive that you need to run a complex company, especially. And in Washington, he wasn't helping. So that's when the board let him go. I forget the date now when that was. It was about the time that Juan phased out too, I think. I'm not sure of that. And Bill Sewell came in. And that was good because Bill, even though he had been in the military his whole life, he was a general in the Air Force. And he had been to Rolls-Royce as the president of Rolls-Royce in North America. So he had some industrial experience. He was good. He brought in some other people that had experience. Bill Crilly from Eastern Airlines, who was an experienced airline guy. He was good. And we this is when we did the cutbacks and so forth and got Pan Am back profitable. So Bill did a good job on that, as far as I was concerned. I knew him, so I was prejudiced, and I certainly, advanced under him. But I think I helped him, and he helped me, and I helped the airline as well, as far as I'm concerned. So we instituted a lot of things, and there was a lot of innovation that you could do at Pan Am because the guy had, from the marketing point of view, and I don't want to make any special claims or anything, but I did a lot of things like that. Which, I mean, the fare structure. I built up a very strong relationship with the travel agent community, which Pan Am had been neglected because they were like the king. And, travel agents were okay, but you had to pay them commissions, and they weren't encouraged. So I spent a lot of time with the travel agents speaking at their groups all over the world. I'd go to their meetings and stuff, and so we ended up getting very good support from the agents. So that was one thing that I was able to do, and the fare structures, we had to fight for those, but that was good. Of course, that's what Juan wanted, and that was the sensible thing to do. We had these big airplanes and plenty of seats to sell for sure. And as long as the thing about lower fares, as long as you have enough restrictions on them so you can preserve your higher fares, your first class passengers. In other words, you put enough restrictions on your low fares so the people that have the money, that want to travel and need to travel on short notice, so you can preserve your higher fares, and that's what we did. That took a lot of study on my part and a lot of discussions. And IATA was a big problem for Pan Am because I mentioned earlier the fare structures had to go through them, and they had to take these votes, and there were 106 airlines. I went to a couple of meetings, and I just threw up. I said, "This is just ridiculous. I mean, this airline's in trouble, and we have to deal with this bureaucracy." And they were all cheating on us anyhow, under the table. So I went to Bill Sill and said, the big thing we have to do, Bill, is get out of IATA. We have to resign. 106 airlines. And when I uttered that, everybody, oh my God, Pan Am founded IATA. You can't do. It's like, how can you even contemplate that? I said, well, look, it's nothing but a negative for us, okay? So at an IATA meeting in France, I got up and said, at the end of its meeting, Pan Am is submitting their resignation. Oh my God, it was like a lightning strike or something. There were people, what, you can't do that. So forth and so on. When I got back to New York, I had to have meetings with the employees because they were all upset too. Well, how can you have been IATA since its founding years? And so I explained it all. That was very helpful, okay? Because now the lawyers, now it wasn't illegal anymore. If we wanted to play games with travel agents they had these stupid things they were doing, like if a travel agent would set up a tour, he has to make a brochure, okay? He has to get it, go to print and design and print and so forth. Well, what these guys were doing, and KLM, and they're all doing, they were paying the travel agents for their tour books. So that was like, several $1,000s they would get as a bonus. Well, we could do that. That was illegal. Well, now we could do that. So we spent out a special office in the legal department. So the marketing guys, when they wanted to make a deal with a travel agent, they had to go to the legal department to get it approved, because now we were out of IATA, so we could do this. So that was a big thing, and that helped enormously in getting enhancing our business, because now we could compete. Okay, if they were doing this, we could match it, or we could do something similar.
And what was it like to be president of this prestigious company?
It was a surprise to me. When I was named president, this is not atypical. I mean, marketing guys, companies are always under attack by the finance department and other, especially if your revenues might be off the plan or something. The marketing guys are always being attacked, and I was under constant attack. Board meetings, I was put on the board of directors by Bill Sewell, which was great. But at the board meetings, very often, I would get attacked by the chief financial officer about, you're missing forecast. That's why we're losing money. So I was always on the edge all those years and figured, at some point I'm going to get fired because the marketing guy always takes the dive when things aren't going well. So we had a big more board meeting. This is in late '77, and I was attacked as usual by the CFO. By the way, his job prior to coming to Pan Am, you're from Ohio, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was the chief financial officer for the state of Ohio.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know. There's always an Ohio connection to everything.
So I'm saying, so I was telling him, if he's attacking me, I'm saying, look, how does a guy go from being the treasurer of the state of Ohio to the CFO of Pan Am? What's the connection? So he and I didn't get along, though, for obvious reasons. So we had this one meeting, a very uncomfortable meeting and so forth, and I was the butt of not the whole meeting, of course, but just when we were doing I had to get up every meeting and give a presentation on our revenues versus plan and so forth. So it's always a bit of discussion about that. As there is in any company, I still do it today in the companies I'm involved with, so it's nothing to do about it. So I had kind of a bad meeting and I went back to my office. I was on the 46th floor in the sort of the center of the hallway, and the chairman was at the corner office, and the boardroom was right opposite his office, a huge boardroom in Pan Am building. So they, after as the board meeting was terminated, they announced they're going to have an executive committee meeting of the board, meaning the managers on the board are not invited. It's just for the outside directors. So I thought to myself, okay, well, when you have the executive committee, it's usually somebody's going to get fired, so it's probably going to be me. So I was totally prepared for it. I thought, at this point, I was 46 years old, and I thought, look, this is a tough job, and there's so many other opportunities I had anyhow. If I get fired, so be it. I was totally prepared. So have the executive committee, everybody's board leaves and so forth. I get a call from the secretary of the chairman. He wants to see me. Come to his office. And, okay, well, this is I'm going to be fired. It's fine. I'm adjusted to it. I'm prepared. So I get out of Sewell's office, and she said, well, Dan, we had an executive committee of the board. And I said, yeah, I'm aware of that, Bill. He said, and the board had asked me to ask you if you'd accept the job as president of the company. I said, what? President of the company? I thought I was going to be fired. I didn't tell him that.
Wow. So you thought you were going to be fired, and they gave you presidency of the company.
So what it was, clearly, the board knew I was doing a good job and doing the best you could do under these circumstances. And this guy was badgering me, was not the whatever. In other words, I was fine. Okay. The board liked what I was doing, and they wanted me to be president. Okay, so you're right. And Sewell had been president and chief executive, and chairman. So they wanted to separate and have it be two jobs. Well, that was fine with me. Bill was the chairman and CEO, and I was president and chief operating officer. So I started having meetings immediately, 7:00 in the morning, all over the world, wanting to know on-time performance, got into all that good stuff. We did good. In fact, in 78, we were made record profits in 1978. 79, we had a very good year. In 1980, another fuel crisis, another Middle East crisis on fuel. So our fuel prices went up. It was a very difficult year. So I'd been with Pan Am then about 10 or 11 years or so. And, I had a lot of opportunities. People were always approaching me. I was being interviewed by the, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. So people at American Express were very high on me, and the American Express would, call me occasionally, just do social things and so forth. So I had opportunities, other than Pan Am. And it was a tough job being a marketing guy at Pan Am. Got me all these troubles that we had. So you can see we're now into 1980. Yeah, towards the end of 1980. And I've been approached by some people to do some other things, okay, outside of Pan Am, which really interested me quite a bit. Bill Sewell became aware of it, and we talked about it. And he said, "Look, Dan, if you want to do this, you're going to, it's not going to work. You're going to have to leave the company." And I said, "Bill, that's the truth, and that's what I want to do." So it was at the very end of 1980. Very end 1980, we parted company, and I went off and did some other things. But the years that the first years I was president were really great years. 78, 79, and 80 was okay, but it was the fuel thing came up again, another fuel crisis, and so I had like 11 years at Pan Am, okay, and obviously they were great years. Good and bad experiences, but overall, I became president at age 46. Okay, so I was still a fairly young guy. I left. I just should turn 50 then.
That's great. So what is it about Pan Am that still captures the public's imagination and attention?
Like you, I would almost ask the same question. But the thing that we had at Pan Am, which was unique, is the employees, the average employee, the pilot, the flight attendant, the average person working at the ticket office or at the airport, they sort of knew of these issues that I was talking to you about overall. But, to them, this was a very prestigious company, which it was. If you were a flight attendant at Pan Am, you were at the top of the drawer, okay? And pretty much the other people as well. And every place we went all over the world, Pan Am was respected. The foreign countries thought that Pan Am was the airline of the U.S., okay? That we were the national carrier, and which we weren't, of course. We were the opposite of that, practically. But so it was and you flew to all these exotic places, and it was just an exciting career. And people got transferred around, they got to visit. And, so it was a great place to work, okay? And it was so unfortunate that you had these economic problems and these regulatory problems, which worked against the company so badly. But we could still survive. And, it went bankrupt in 1991. So that was 11 years after I left the company. Back in that era, Delta went bankrupt, American went bankrupt, United went bankrupt. Okay, so because it was, again, a troubled situation with fuel and this and that and all kinds of the airlines now, they weren't protected like they were, as I said, back in 1973 and 74. There was no price controls or anything like that. So they were suffering like everybody. And they all went bankrupt.
Were you ever the heir apparent to Mr. Sewell?
Yeah, I could have been probably if I'd have stayed with the company. I probably would have been. The board was. I found this out afterwards. The board was very. I had a good relationship with the board of directors. They liked what I did, and I had a good, because I heard from a lot of them after I left, and so yeah, I was a logical successor, so probably.
Looking back, do you have any second guesses about leaving, or do you still think that was the right decision for you?
Yeah, for me personally, it was the right decision because I have a lot of entrepreneurial instincts built into me. And when you run a company as limited, and I say limited in terms of actions you can take because of its size and the regulatory issues and the labor issues and so forth, It's hard to do entrepreneurial things. And so I went down that other route and had a very successful career and made, a lot of money and so forth. And although I didn't do it for money, I mean, that's not one of my, if I wanted money when I graduated from Harvard, I'd have gone to Wall Street. Okay. And I was,
Good point.
no way I was going to do that. And people say, you're going to the airlines? Well, you must be out of your mind. I mean, you don't make any money.
So this podcast program is listened to all over the world. And we have a museum on Long Island outside of New York City where visitors from all over the world come to see the Pan Am Museum within the Cradle of Aviation Museum. What message do you have for people that are interested in Pan Am history? And also, what message do you have for the former employees that worked for Pan Am when you were part of leadership?
Well, I was, let's start with that first. I was very much sensitive to employees. I always felt close to them. I supported Aware, which was in fact, Sewell didn't particularly like Aware. He thought it was just a nuisance, but I supported Aware. When I left Pan Am, the Aware group took out an ad in the New York Times thanking me for my service. Bill Sewell got very pissed off at that. I said, nothing to do with it, Bill. I didn't know about it. I saw it the next day myself.
And for our listeners, can you explain what Aware is?
Aware was, they came up with the name, meaning they're aware of our situation. It was a group of employees, it really started by a flight attendant, and she motivated the flight attendants and the pilots and a lot of the ground people as well to form a group. And they had meetings all over, they had chapters of several cities. And they decided on their own that they were going to go plead Pan Am's case with the government. Where, let's say, management was unable to get a hearing on the Hill with important people. A bunch of employees show up in uniform and say, "Hey, here's the story. We're getting improperly treated." They got a good reception because if you go to a politician's office and you're this president or the chief marketing officer or something, I mean, you're very suspect. Okay, when you walk in, but an employee, an attractive employee, especially wearing a uniform and so forth, they would get an audience. And I'm not sure what they accomplished, but their mission was very, very positive, and it showed the basic love of the company, if I can use that term, that the employees had. And it's amazing to this day. Okay, they went bankrupt in 91, and this is 22. Okay, I mean, it's getting 30 years here, and you still have employees, former employees, of course, that are willing to support the company. And of course, I joined the foundation as well, and I'm happy to help them however I can. And there's this incredible loyalty. They were basically good employees, most, upscale. There weren't any low-level people that were part of Pan Am. These were well-trained, dedicated people, okay? And due to this combination of events, it's so unfortunate that it had to end up in a liquidation of the company. Bankruptcy was not a disgrace. Okay, bankruptcy laws are set up to let companies reorganize, and every major airline, I'm sure there are exceptions, I can't remember exactly, but all the majors, went into Chapter 11 and struggled to get out, and they did, and here they are, they're still flying, and Pan Am's gone and got all split up into pieces and so forth. Of course, employees went with these airlines, and they still had jobs. At least most of them did. I think a lot probably didn't. But it was a tragedy, frankly. I'd been gone for so long, and I just was stunned by the fact that they were, went into the liquidation process, Chapter 7. But I understood, and that's why I still am part of the group that's holding it together. I'm amazed and pleased by the fact that we still have that spirit. And now I'm trying to recruit my daughters to join, and a lot of the people, former employees, are getting their offspring to join the foundation and so forth.
Excellent. Well, also tell them about the Pan Am podcast.
Yeah, that's right. No, I will for sure. Yeah, no, that's going to be very helpful, and thank you for doing that. That's going to be a wonderful thing. No, it's because it is an interesting story. I mean, Pan Am was a major factor in the development of air travel worldwide. Okay, from day one, and you just have to admire one trip for that type of initiative and vision and so forth. He couldn't resist a 747. In retrospect, I would say we'd probably been better off because we had plenty of airplanes. We had one of the problems we had is in the marketing area. Where are we going to put these airplanes? We were getting one a week, okay, and okay, we put one. Obviously, London, Paris, Rome, Rio. People wanted to a couple of Japan, but you have to stop in Alaska in those days. It couldn't go nonstop. And put something in the Hawaii market, which was very low yield. Didn't work in the Caribbean. We put some to Rio and Venezuela, stuff like that. But they kept coming, okay. And they started putting them in Amsterdam. Well, that's a very marginal market, and we actually had pretty good luck putting them in Africa because we served 18 countries in Africa. So we puddle jumped across Africa, starting in Senegal and ending up in Nairobi, going up different routes each day, and went to South Africa to Joburg and so forth. So we ended up getting them distributed, but it was before its time. It was too because we were still taking deliveries on 707s. We had a lot of capacity and put most of 707s into reserve fleet and so forth. But it was probably been better if not introduced. The 747 was not invented, was not created as a commercial airplane. It was created by Boeing to compete with the C-5. And that contract went to Lockheed. You know what the C-5 is?
Mm-hmm.
Monster cargo plane. Well, the 747 was created as a cargo plane. And that's why we had the cockpit on the second level. Because the nose could open up, and it was designed, the landing gear was going to collapse. So you'd go right down to ground level and roll on cargo that way. That was the design. Boeing lost to Lockheed. So being very creative, they said, hey, let's try to sell this to the airlines. Change it around, make it into a commercial airplane and seats 400 people or so, depending. And made the rounds. I was at American, and when they came to us the first time, we said, no, it's just a great airplane, but we can't use that kind of capacity. I mean, it's way too big. And we're still absorbing 707s and so forth. And that was a general feeling, I think, throughout the world. But it caught people's imagination. It's this giant airplane now. I mean, wow, this is fantastic. One had that sense. I mean, he was good at that. I mean, he's first across the Pacific. I mean, you go on and on about the things that Pan Am did that were, breakthrough type of new that's which were very exciting to everybody, including employees. Employees loved it. I mean, hey, we're Pan Am, and we're respected every place we go and so forth. There's no doubt, when I was at Pan Am, I never had to explain And I was always given respect as whatever my position was because I was with Pan Am. So I think that explains his loyalty, and because that doesn't happen in typical
Mm-hmm.
times. I mean,
Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything you'd like to tell future generations that may be interested in learning more about Pan Am history?
well, I think I would say things you've no doubt already heard, but well, when you do creative things on a massive scale that Pan Am was able to do it with such, worldwide visibility. I would encourage people to think big. I've, in my own way, I've always thought beyond the small things. I took one of my notable accomplishments. I think I have a few, but one certainly was taking the Iridium satellite out of bankruptcy. Okay, it was a system that cost $5 billion to build. This 66 satellites in space that gave global coverage. And my Pan Am background actually got me interested because when we couldn't commute with our airplanes, they would be gone for hours at a time. We could never commute with them. Now you have a global satellite system where I could dial in and speak to any captain, any place, literally any place in the world. Whatever the North Pole, South Pole, Middle Pacific, or Atlantic, I could dial them up and say, hey, or they could dial up when they had a problem. And so I had the vision to take that company out of bankruptcy when every big company in the world had turned it down. And it's now has a market capitalization of $50 billion. So, I mean, it's
Wow.
one of those things that it's hard to explain why companies that could easily have done what I did and so much easier. But as an individual, I was able to do it. And sort of that's kind of the Pan Am spirit. I mean, doing these things that were very unique and creative, and the employees loved that. And I think it was appreciated by even the competitors admired Pan Am, I think, for that initiative. The fact that they were first with almost everything. One was first with everything he did, including the 747, of course. And it was a winning strategy.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for your time coming on the program. We appreciate you taking the time to share these stories and your very unique insight.
Well, I'm happy to do it, and the tradition of Pan Am is certainly one that I'm very happy to help continue, because it's something that's worthwhile. My biggest disappointment today, now that I'm 91 years old, I ask a young person, these places, where did you work? Oh, I worked at Pan Am. They look at me and say, was that an airline? These are young people, but not so young, by the way.
Well, that's what we're trying to change. That's what the museum and this program and all of the museum's initiatives and programming, that's what we're trying to keep alive.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for doing that. And it shows your sensitivity to, great things too. So you can be admired for that.
Again, Mr. Colussy, as a fellow Italian, it's an honor to talk to you. And I certainly appreciate your time, and you taking the time to talk to me. It truly is an honor, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Oh, bye-bye.
Pan Am was a pioneer in air travel and still stands as one of the most iconic and innovative airlines in aviation history. That legacy lives on at the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York, where you can explore the rich history of the aircrafts and individuals at the heart of the company known as the world's most experienced airline. For more information about the Pan Am Museum, check out our website at www.panam.com. thepanammuseum.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As was once a tagline in one of our commercials, we would greatly appreciate your support to help the Pan Am Museum continue making the going great. You can also support the museum by shopping on our online store for all things Pan Am, accessories, apparel, jewelry, books, models, and posters. We want to hear from you. If you have a question for us or want to share your story, our email address is podcast@thepanammuseum.org. As flight crews once said to passengers departing for their destinations around the world, thank you for flying, Pan Am.